He wasn't alone, not even close. If you looked at his life from the outside, you'd probably say he had everything most people wish for. People around him. Conversations are happening almost every day. Plans are filling up his calendar. There were friends who checked in, colleagues who respected him, family members who stayed in touch. He wasn't forgotten. He wasn't ignored. In fact, he was included. Dinners happened regularly. Messages popped up on his phone. Invitations came without him asking. And yet, almost every night when everything got quiet, the same thought returned. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. I shouldn't feel this alone. And that's what confused him the most. Because loneliness, it is supposed to come from being alone, from being isolated, from being cut off. But he wasn't. He was surrounded. And still, something felt off. Something subtle but persistent. Like being in a room full of noise but not hearing anything that truly reaches you. Like smiling during conversations but feeling slightly disconnected the whole time. It didn't make sense. And that's exactly what made it harder to understand. Because when something is obvious, you can fix it. But when everything looks fine on the surface, where do you even begin? Part 1. When company doesn't remove loneliness. Lucas was 40. At this stage of life, most things had settled into place. He knew how to navigate social situations. He understood people. He could hold conversations easily, without effort. Nothing about him suggested struggle. If anything, he appeared stable, comfortable in his routines, confident in his interactions. He had long-term friendships, the kind that lasted years, the kind where you don't need to explain everything because history already fills in the gaps. He didn't struggle to connect with people. That part worked. But something inside those connections always felt slightly incomplete. Not broken, just shallow in a way he couldn't fully explain. Conversations flowed easily, but they rarely went deeper. They stayed on safe ground. Work, daily updates, plans for the weekend, stories about things that happened, all normal, all fine, even enjoyable in the moment. But afterwards, something was missing. He couldn't point to a specific problem, and no one was doing anything wrong. There were no conflicts, no major misunderstandings, just a quiet sense that something essential wasn't being touched. He once described it like this: "It's like I'm there, but only partially." That feeling showed up in small ways. He would sit with friends, laughing at the right moments, responding at the right time. But inside, he felt slightly distant, not disconnected enough to leave, but not connected enough to feel fulfilled. It was a strange middle space, and the more he noticed it, the harder it became to ignore, because everything looked fine, which meant there was nothing obvious to fix. And that's where the confusion deepened. If you're surrounded by people, if conversations are happening, if relationships exist, then why does loneliness still show up? Why does it stay? We're at part 2. The difference between being seen and being known. At first, it's easy to assume loneliness is about numbers. More people equals less loneliness. That's the simple equation most people believe. But reality doesn't always follow that rule. Because connection isn't just about presence, it's about depth. It's about how much of you actually exists inside the relationship. One day, I asked Lucas a simple question. Nothing complicated, just direct. Who really knows what you feel? He didn't answer right away. Not because the answer was difficult, but because it required him to pause in a way he wasn't used to it. He thought about the people in his life, close friends, family, people he trusted, and yet the answer wasn't obvious, not because they didn't care. Yeah, but because that part of him rarely entered the conversation. Most of his interactions focused on things that were easy to share. Facts, plans, opinions, stories, things that move conversations forward without slowing them down. But the emotional layer, the part that sits underneath everything, that stayed mostly internal, not hidden on purpose, just not expressed. And that's where something important becomes clear. Being seen is not the same as being known. People could see Lucas. They knew what he did, what he liked, how he spent his time. They recognized him in their lives. But knowing someone, that requires something deeper. It requires access to their inner world, their thoughts when they're alone. Their feelings don't always make sense, their doubts, their uncertainties, their quiet moments. And if that part never gets shared, then even strong relationships can feel incomplete because people are connecting to what's visible, while the most personal parts remain unseen. And over time, that gap starts to feel like distance, even when no physical distance exists. Part 3. Why some people don't express their inner world. A lot of people assume that talking about feelings is natural, like it's something everyone just knows how to do. But that's not always true. For some, it doesn't come easily at all. Not because they don't have emotions, but because expressing them never became part of how they function. Lucas wasn't the kind of person who bottled things up in a dramatic way. He didn't feel like he was hiding. He didn't feel blocked. If anything, he felt normal. He could describe his day, explain what happened, share opinions about different situations. All of that came easily. But when it came to something more internal, something slower, more personal, there was hesitation. Not fear exactly, more like unfamiliarity. He wasn't used to going there, so he simply didn't. And over time, that became his default way of interacting. Conversations stayed practical. They moved quickly. They stayed on the surface, not because they had to, but because that's what felt natural to him. It's interesting how habits form like this, not through a single decision, but through repetition. You do something one way again and again until it feels like the only way. And that's what happened here. Lucas didn't decide to keep his emotions private. He just never practiced sharing them. So when moments came where he could open up, he didn't know how to step into them. Not clearly, not comfortably. And because of that, those moments often passed by quietly. Someone might ask a deeper question, and he would answer, but in a limited way. Enough to respond, but not enough to reveal. And no one questioned it, because on the outside, everything still looked fine. He was responsive, engaged, present in the conversation, but only partially. And that's the part most people don't notice. You can be fully present physically, even socially active, and still not be emotionally visible. And when that happens consistently, relationships begin to form around that limited version of you. Not because people don't want more, but because they only interact with what you show them. So if your inner world stays quiet, they learn to stay on the surface too, without even realizing it. Part 4, a childhood where emotions were respected, but rarely discussed. To understand where this pattern came from, you have to go back a little, back to the environment where it started. Lucas grew up in a good home. There was no chaos, no instability. His parents were supportive. They provided what was needed. There was structure. There was care. From the outside, everything looked healthy, and in many ways, it was. But there was one subtle detail that shaped more than anyone realized. Emotions were present, but they weren't explored. If something went wrong, the focus quickly shifted to fixing it. If someone felt upset, the response was practical. What can we do about it? How do we solve this? And once a solution appeared, the moment moved on. There wasn't much space to sit inside the feeling itself, to talk about it in depth, to ask questions like, Why did this affect you? What did you feel exactly? What stayed with you afterward? Those conversations didn't really happen, not because emotions were ignored, but because they weren't seen as something that needed attention for a long time. They were acknowledged. Then, they gently pushed aside in favor of moving forward. And when you grow up in that kind of environment, you learn something without being told directly. You learn that emotions are private, not secret, not wrong, just like personal, something you deal with internally, then continue with your day. So Lucas adapted to that rhythm. He didn't suppress what he felt. He experienced it, but he processed it alone, quietly, without involving others. And over time, that became normal, even comfortable, not because it matched everything he had known. There's something important here. People often assume that emotional distance comes from negative experiences, from being shut down or dismissed, but sometimes it comes from something much softer, a calm environment where emotions simply weren't discussed deeply, where everything worked well enough that no one felt the need to go further, and that creates a different kind of habit, one where emotional sharing doesn't feel necessary, even when it is. Because connection, real connection, doesn't just happen through presence, it happens through understanding. And understanding requires visibility, not just of actions, but of inner experience. And if that part was never practiced early on, it doesn't naturally appear later. It has to be learned. In part 5, why his relationships remain partial. As Lucas moved into adulthood, nothing about this pattern felt like a problem. It simply followed him, quietly. He built relationships the same way he always had, through shared experiences, through conversations, through time spent together. And all of that worked. He had people in his life, reliable ones, people who showed up, people who cared. But even inside those relationships, something remained just out of reach. Because while he shared what was happening around him, he rarely shared what was happening inside him. Not intentionally, it just didn't come up. Or when it did, it passed quickly. And this created a subtle imbalance, not visible on the surface, but present underneath. People interacted with the version of Lucas they could see, his thoughts, his plans, or his reactions to external things. But the deeper layer, the emotional context behind everything, stayed mostly hidden. And here's the key part. Connection isn't built only on interaction, it's built on mutual visibility, on the feeling that both people are known beyond the surface. So when one side remains partially unseen, the connection adjusts to that level. It doesn't break, it doesn't fail, it simply stays limited, functional, but not fully fulfilling. And that's exactly where Lucas found himself, surrounded by relationships that worked, but didn't quite reach him, because the part of him that needed to be reached wasn't fully present inside them, not because others didn't try, but because they didn't have access. And without that access, even strong relationships can feel distant. Even frequent conversations can feel empty. Even shared moments can feel incomplete. It's not about the number of people in your life. It's about how much of you actually exists within those connections. And for a long time, Lucas existed in them, but only in part, which meant something essential was always missing, even if he couldn't fully explain what it was. Part 6. The moment he understood the paradox. The shift didn't happen through a big realization. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden breakthrough that changed everything overnight. It started small, almost unnoticeable at first. Just a conversation, like many others he had before. It was with a close friend, someone he had known for years, someone he trusted. They were sitting together, talking the way they usually did, casual, easy, nothing heavy. At some point, Lucas mentioned something simple. He said he had been feeling tired lately. Not in a dramatic way, just as a passing comment. The kind of thing people say all the time without expecting it to go anywhere. Normally, that's where the moment would end. A quick response, maybe a light joke. Then the conversation moves on. But this time, something different happened. His friend didn't just nod, didn't just acknowledge it politely. Instead, he asked a follow-up question, a simple one, but direct. "How are you actually doing?" Not in a casual tone, not as a formality, but with real attention. And for a moment, Lucas paused. It wasn't a long pause, but it was enough to feel unfamiliar, because the question wasn't about what was happening around him. It was about what was happening inside him. And that's where things usually stayed quiet. His first instinct was to respond the usual way. Keep it light, keep it simple, move forward. But something about the way the question was asked made that feel incomplete. Like giving a surface answer would miss something important. So instead, he hesitated, just slightly, and then he did something different. He answered honestly, not in a dramatic way. He didn't suddenly open up about everything. He didn't turn the conversation into something heavy. He just stayed with the question a little longer and spoke from a place he usually didn't access in conversations. He said he'd been feeling off, a bit disconnected, tired, not just physically, but mentally. Like things were moving, but he wasn't fully inside them. It wasn't a perfect explanation. It didn't need to be, because something else changed in that moment. The conversation slowed down, not awkwardly, naturally. His friend didn't rush to respond, didn't try to fix anything. He just listened, fully. And then he responded in the same way. Open, present, real. And that's when Lucas noticed something he hadn't felt in a long time. Presence. Not the kind that comes from being around someone, but the kind that comes from being understood, even if only partially, even if only for a moment. There was a shift in the atmosphere, and nothing dramatic on the surface, but internally, it felt different, like the conversation had weight, like it mattered in a way most conversations didn't. And that's when something clicked. Not as a clear thought, but as a feeling. A realization that didn't need words right away. For the first time, he saw the gap. Not in his relationships, but in how he showed up inside them. He saw that people had always been there, available, open in their own ways, but he hadn't been bringing all of himself into those spaces. Not intentionally, just by habit. And because of that, they were connecting with a version of him that was only partially visible, which meant the connection itself could only go so far. It wasn't about effort. It wasn't about finding better people. It was about access. What part of you do others actually get to experience? That question stayed with him, quietly. And once he noticed it, he couldn't unsee it. He started recognizing the pattern in real time. Moments where he could say a little more, but didn't. Moments where conversations could go deeper, but stayed on the surface. Not because they had to, but because that's where he naturally kept them. And now, he began to see the cost of that. Not as something dramatic, but as something subtle and constant. A kind of distance that existed even in closeness. And for the first time, he understood the paradox. You can be surrounded by people and still feel alone if the part of you that needs connection is never fully present. Part 7, Allowing Others to See More, 2030 to 2230. Change didn't happen all at once. There was no sudden transformation, no moment where everything became easy. If anything, it felt slightly uncomfortable in the beginning, because doing something new often does. Lucas didn't decide to completely open up overnight. That would have felt unnatural, too much, too fast. Instead, he started small, almost quietly, in moments that didn't seem significant at first. A simple conversation, a familiar setting, the same kind of interactions he'd always had. But this time, he made a slight adjustment. Instead of only sharing what happened, he added a little of what he felt. Nothing dramatic, just small details, subtle shifts. If someone asked about his day, he still answered the same way. But sometimes, he included something extra. I was a bit stressed about it. I didn't really enjoy that part. It felt strange, actually. Simple sentences, easy to say, but different from how he used to respond. At first, it felt unusual, like stepping into a space he wasn't fully used to. There was a moment of hesitation each time, a quick thought, should I say this? But he didn't overthink it. He just let it happen, and something interesting followed. Most people didn't react dramatically. They didn't make it awkward. They didn't question it. They simply responded naturally, as if that level of sharing had always been welcome, and in some cases, they matched it. They shared a little more of themselves too. Not because they were asked to, but because the space allowed it. That's how connection often works. It builds through permission, unspoken. When one person opens a small door, the other often does the same. And over time, those small moments started to add up. Conversations felt slightly different, still familiar, but with more depth, more pauses, more presence. Not every interaction changed. Some relationships stayed the same, and that was okay, because not every connection is meant to go deeper. But some did, gradually, without force, without effort, just through consistency, through small acts of honesty, repeated over time. Lucas began to notice something shifting inside him, that quiet feeling of distance. It didn't disappear instantly, but it softened, less frequent, less intense, because now, parts of him that had always stayed internal were starting to exist outside too, in conversations, in shared moments, in real interactions with real people. And that changed the experience entirely. Because connection isn't just about being with others, it's about being experienced by them. And allowing yourself to be experienced takes a kind of openness that doesn't always come naturally. But once it begins, even in small ways, everything starts to shift. Not perfectly, not completely, but meaningfully. Lucas didn't become a different person. He didn't suddenly share everything. Or he didn't turn every conversation into something deep. He simply allowed more of himself to exist within the relationships he already had. And that was enough to start changing how they felt. Because when emotional reality enters the space, even quietly, connection becomes something more than interaction. It becomes a shared experience. And in that shared space, loneliness has less room to stay. Not because it's forced out, but because something else takes its place. Something subtle, but real. The feeling of being seen, not just on the surface, but a little deeper than before. And sometimes, that small difference changes everything. Closing, 2230 to 2400. Months later, when Lucas looked back on everything, nothing about his life had changed dramatically. He still had the same friends, the same routines, the same kind of days. From the outside, it all looked the same. But internally, something was different. That constant feeling of quiet loneliness, the one that used to show up almost every night. It wasn't as strong anymore, not completely gone, but no longer sitting at the center of everything. And when he tried to explain what had changed, he didn't use complicated words. He said it simply. I wasn't actually alone. I was just invisible in my own relationships. And that realization stayed with him. because it explains something that had never made sense before. How can you be surrounded by people and still feel like no one is really with you? Not because they don't care, not because they aren't present, but because the part of you that needs to be seen never fully enters the space between you. It stays inside, unshared, unspoken, unnoticed. And over time, that creates a distance that feels like loneliness, even when the connection is technically there. That's the part most people miss. Loneliness isn't always about missing people. Sometimes it's about the missing presence within the relationships you already have. And presence doesn't come from proximity alone. It comes from visibility, from allowing parts of your inner world to be seen by someone else, even in small ways, even imperfectly, because it doesn't require big conversations. It doesn't require saying everything all at once. Sometimes it starts with something very simple, telling the truth about how you feel in a moment where you would normally stay quiet, letting a sentence go a little deeper instead of keeping it on the surface, allowing someone to see just a little more of you than you usually show, and noticing what happens next, because more often than not, people don't pull away from that. They move closer, not dramatically, but naturally, as if that's what they were waiting for all along, and that's where something shifts, not in the number of people in your life, but in the quality of connection within it. Because when even one relationship becomes more real, more honest, more open, it changes how everything feels. It reminds you that connection isn't something distant. It isn't something you have to go out and find somewhere else. Sometimes it's already there, waiting quietly for you to step into it a little more fully, to bring more of yourself into the space, to be seen, not just as who you appear to be, but as who you actually are beneath all of that. And maybe that's where it begins, not by searching for new people, but by allowing the people already in your life to see you more clearly than before, even if it feels unfamiliar at first, even if it feels small. Because sometimes the distance you feel isn't between you and others, it's between what you show and what you keep inside. And closing that distance, even slightly, can change everything.